The senior VP was already 12 minutes late to the biggest merger presentation of his career. But a blind woman standing at the edge of a subway platform asked him not to leave her alone. He had no idea who she was. The morning of March 14th hit Chicago like something personal. The wind came off Lake Michigan in long, punishing sheets, the kind that didn't just cut through your coat but seemed to locate every doubt you'd ever had and press on it. Connor Spade stood at the top of the underground stairs at the Monroe Street station, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm, his phone burning hot against his palm with back-to-back notifications he hadn't opened yet. He knew what they said. He didn't need to read them. The Alderton Group acquisition had been his project for 14 months. Every model, every forecast, every slide in that 60-page deck had passed through his hands at least a dozen times. He had sacrificed 2 weekends in January, a Thanksgiving dinner, and the better part of his marriage remaining goodwill to get this deal to the finish line. And today, 9:47 a.m., Marchetti Capital's 42nd floor boardroom, full partner attendance, was the morning it either became real or became the thing people whispered about in the break room for the next decade. He was supposed to be there at 9:30. Connor descended the stairs fast, his shoes hitting each step with the mechanical precision of a man running a calculation in his head. If the red line was running on time, he could still make it to the Marchetti building by 10. That was survivable. That was explainable. That was not ideal, but it was not fatal. He pushed through the turnstile and felt the platform air hit him, stale, underground warm, a complete contrast to the lake wind above. The digital board said 8 minutes. He exhaled. 8 minutes was fine. 8 minutes was something he could work with. That was when he heard her voice. It was quiet, which was why it registered at all. On a busy Chicago platform in the morning rush, with the low vibration of an incoming train already humming through the concrete, a quiet voice shouldn't have been audible. But something about the particular frequency of it, uncertain, careful, the voice of someone trying very hard not to sound frightened, cut clean through the noise. "Excuse me, is anyone there?" Connor turned. She was standing at the far edge of the platform, perhaps 4 feet from the yellow safety line, closer to the drop than she should have been. She looked to be in her late 70s, small inside a heavy gray wool coat, her white hair pinned neatly under a dark hat. In one hand she held the folded aluminum cane of someone recently learning to navigate without sight. She was turning her head slowly left and right in the precise, calibrated way of a person trying to use sound as a compass in a space that gave her very little back. Connor looked at his phone. 7 minutes now. He looked at the woman. He looked at the gap between her shoes and the yellow line. His chest tightened with the specific, terrible clarity of a moment that does not offer you a graceful exit. He had a presentation to save. He had 14 months of work and an entire firm's trust sitting in the boardroom upstairs. He had a career that had been built on never being the man who was caught underprepared. And the nearest person to this woman, a college kid with headphones, a woman in scrubs already speedwalking toward the far staircase, was not going to stop. He knew that the way you know the temperature without checking. A sharper, colder thought surfaced before he could stop it. No one would blame him. She wasn't in immediate danger. There were other people on the platform. The train was 8 minutes out. Someone else would notice. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked to her. "Ma'am." He kept his voice even, not startling. "I'm right here, Connor. You're a little close to the edge. Can I help you step back?" She turned toward him immediately, relief reorganizing her whole face. "Oh, thank you. I got turned around coming off the elevator. I usually take the bus, but it was rerouted this morning and She stopped herself. "I'm sorry, I don't want to hold you." "You're not holding me," Connor said. It was a lie. He was very aware that it was a lie, but he said it without hesitation, and something about saying it out loud made it feel less like a lie and more like a decision. He guided her back from the edge, one hand light on her elbow, until she was standing safely behind the yellow line with the wall of the platform at her back. She held her cane in both hands now, more settled. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Michigan Avenue, the Art Institute's stop." She paused. "My daughter teaches a class there Thursday mornings. I try to surprise her when the weather isn't terrible." A small, dry smile crossed her face. "Today is not that day." "No," Connor agreed. "It is not." His phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession. He didn't take it out. "I'm Winifred," she said. "Winnie Connor Spade. Are you in a hurry, Mr. Spade?" He looked at the board. 5 minutes. He looked at Winnie. She was gripping her cane in a way that looked like she was trying to keep her hands still. "A little," he said honestly, "but I've got 5 minutes before the train. Then I'll stop talking." "You don't have to stop talking." She didn't stop talking. She told him, in the compressed, efficient way of someone who had learned to make conversation count, that she'd lost most of her sight 18 months ago. Macular degeneration, quick progression. She'd been relearning the city she'd lived in for 42 years, as a series of sounds and distances and textures underfoot. The Monroe Street platform, she explained, was one she'd only used twice before. The elevator landing didn't have a tactile guide strip the way the State Street station did. She'd stepped off disoriented and drifted the wrong direction. Connor listened. He noticed that he was listening, not the polite, surface-level processing he applied to most conversations before a pitch, but actually following what she was saying, tracking the specific, careful architecture of a life rebuilt around new limitations. The train arrived. He helped her board, confirmed her stop with the conductor, and stood on the platform watching the doors close. Then he stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Then he ran. The Marchetti Capitol lobby was all black granite and vertical light, the kind of space designed to communicate that the people who worked here had already won. Connor crossed it at something just short of a jog, his portfolio under one arm, his phone finally open in his other hand. 32 notifications, 6 missed calls from Douglas, his managing director. 1 text from Reeves, his associate, that simply read, "They're asking where you are." He took the elevator to 42. He smoothed his coat in the mirrored interior. His reflection looked like a man who had made several decisions in the last hour that he couldn't entirely explain. He pushed open the glass doors of the conference suite at 10:09 a.m. The room was full. 12 people seated around a curved walnut table. The projector already live, the deck already running. His deck, his numbers, his year and 2 months of work. Standing at the front of the room with a laser pointer, and the particular ease of a man who had prepared for exactly this opportunity, was Vincent Harrow, Connor's deputy director. 34 years old, perfectly groomed, the kind of ambitious that doesn't bother hiding itself because it has never needed to. Vincent paused mid-sentence when Connor entered. Everyone turned. At the head of the table, in the single leather chair that sat apart from the others by approximately 6 inches, enough to be unmistakable, sat Gus Marchetti. 71 years old, third-generation capital, the man whose name was on the building, and whose handshake was still the only thing that closed a deal in his firm. He did not look up from the papers in front of him when Connor walked in. That was, Connor knew, not a good sign. "Mr. Spade," said Douglas from across the table, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone managing a scene. "Good of you to join us, Mr. Marchetti." Connor addressed the head of the table directly, because there was no version of this moment that got better by looking at Douglas. "I apologize for the delay. There was a situation on the platform." "There's always a situation," said Douglas. Connor stopped. He knew that tone. He had used that tone himself on younger associates, on interns, who showed up with excuses nested inside apologies. "There's always a situation" meant, "I have already made a judgment, and this conversation is a formality." "Sit down, Connor," Douglas said. "Vincent has it covered." Connor sat in the only open chair, which was at the far end of the table, away from the screen, away from the decision-makers, squarely in the position of observer. He watched Vincent advance through his slides. Vincent was good. Connor would give him that, with the cold objectivity of a man watching someone else drive his car. The analysis was sound. The recommendations were sharp. The room was nodding. He looked down at his portfolio. He opened it. He looked at the tabs he'd marked in red, the sections he'd planned to walk through, personally, the 2 pivot points in the deal structure that he knew were going to draw questions. Questions that Vincent, for all his polish, was not going to see coming, because he hadn't been in the room for the first 3 meetings with the Alderton team, hadn't heard the specific concerns their CFO had raised in October, hadn't built the contingency models that had addressed those concerns, and that were currently sitting, unmarked, in a folder on Connor's laptop. The first question came from a woman named Patricia Shen, Marchetti's head of risk. She asked it in the precise, undeflectable way of someone whose job was to find the structural fault in any argument. She pointed at slide 31 and asked Vincent to explain the liability exposure in the second-tier acquisition clause. Vincent paused. The pause was half a second too long. It was the kind of pause that, to everyone in a room like this one, said, "I don't have the answer, and I'm about to tell you something adjacent to it." Connor looked at Gus Marchetti. Gus Marchetti was looking at Connor. Connor had not been invited to speak. He opened his mouth anyway. The exposure is capped, he said from the far end of the table. It was renegotiated in the November revision. Alderton agreed to a hard ceiling of 8% of the secondary asset value, with a 90-day cure period before any clawback triggers. The model on slide 44 shows the downside scenario under those terms. We stress-tested it against 3 recession baselines. Patricia Shen turned. She looked at him for a moment. "Show me," she said. Connor stood up. He walked to the front of the room. Vincent stepped aside. Not gracefully, but he stepped aside. Connor connected his laptop. He didn't apologize for being late again. He didn't explain himself. He pulled up slide 44 and he worked. The meeting ended at 12:40. The room cleared with the purposeful efficiency of people who build by the hour. Connor was packing up his laptop when Douglas appeared at his shoulder. "We need to talk," Douglas said. "I know, not here." They took the elevator down together in silence. In the lobby, Douglas found a corner near the window, away from the foot traffic. He crossed his arms. He was a careful, measured man, Douglas. Not unkind, but not soft either, and very clear about what the firm's expectations looked like. "You understand what this morning looked like," Douglas said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Vincent was prepared to run the entire presentation. He ran most of it. He ran it because you weren't there, Connor. You have been on this deal since January of last year. Marchetti specifically asked for you at 9:30, not 9:45, not 10:09. Douglas paused. He looked out at the street. "Gus Marchetti doesn't ask for people twice." "I understand. Do you want to tell me what happened?" Connor considered the question. He thought about Winnie, her careful grip on the aluminum cane, the particular hush of her voice on a loud platform, the way she'd said, "I don't want to hold you," without knowing how precisely she had identified the exact thing he was trying to calculate. He thought about the 3 seconds he'd stood there running the math. "There was a woman on the platform," he said, visually impaired. "She was standing too close to the edge. I helped her get settled and make sure she boarded safely." Douglas looked at him. "That's it?" "That's it." A short silence. Douglas uncrossed his arms. He looked at Connor with an expression that was difficult to categorize, somewhere between frustration and something less legible. "Connor, the Marchetti relationship took 4 years to build. This acquisition is the largest deal we've fielded in 3 years. You know that. I do. And you stopped to help a stranger on a subway platform." "I did." Douglas looked out the window again. "That's either the most decent thing I've heard all quarter or the most expensive." He walked away. Connor stood in the lobby alone, his laptop bag over his shoulder, the gray March light coming through the glass. He thought about calling someone. His wife, maybe, except they were 3 months into a separation that neither of them had named yet, and the conversation would require context he didn't have the bandwidth for. He thought about going back to the office. He thought about what Douglas had said. Gus Marchetti doesn't ask for people twice. He walked outside. The wind hit him again, same as the morning, same lake, off the same water. He walked until he found a coffee shop that didn't play music, ordered a black coffee he didn't particularly want, and sat at a table by the window watching the city move. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was Marchetti Capital's main line. He answered. "Mr. Spade, it was Gus Marchetti's assistant. Mr. Marchetti would like to see you. Are you available at 2 o'clock? Gus Marchetti's private office was on the 45th floor, a level above the conference suite, in a room that looked like it hadn't been redesigned since 1989, and was very comfortable with that. Dark wood, framed nautical maps, a sideboard with a crystal decanter that probably wasn't for decoration. The window looked out over Grant Park, and, beyond it, the gray sweep of the lake. Gus was standing at that window when Connor was shown in. He didn't turn immediately. He was a wide-shouldered man, shorter than Connor had expected the first time they met, with white hair cut close and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades letting other people fill silence. "Sit down," Gus said. Connor sat. He did not apologize again. Gus finally turned. He crossed the room and sat across from Connor in a chair that was angled slightly away from the desk, which Connor read correctly as deliberate. An invitation to a conversation rather than a performance review. Patricia Shen liked the November revision, Gus said. The cap was her concern in the first meeting, Connor said. I built the ceiling into the October draft specifically because of how she asked the question. She told me. Gus looked at him steadily. Vincent didn't know about it. Vincent came onto the project in December. A pause. Gus folded his hands in his lap. He had the hands of someone who had spent a lot of time shaking other people's hands, deliberate, unhurried. "Douglas tells me you were held up on the platform." Connor nodded. "Blind woman?" "Yes, sir. Monroe Street Station." Connor looked at him. "You know the station." "I know Winifred Pace," Gus said. The name took a second to land. Connor was quiet. The room was very quiet. "She called my office an hour ago," Gus continued. "Wanted to thank the man who helped her this morning. She had your name. She's sharp, Winnie. She listens well. She said you didn't check your phone once while you were standing with her." Connor had no response to that. "She also said you lied to her," Gus added without accusation. "I told her she wasn't holding me." "Yes." Gus almost smiled. That's the part she noticed. He was quiet for a moment. "She's my wife's older sister. She moved back to Chicago after Eleanor passed. We look in on her when we can, but she won't be looked after, you understand. She insists on navigating on her own terms." Connor sat with that for a moment. "I didn't know, of course you didn't." Gus looked at him. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" He leaned forward slightly. "I've been in this business for 40 years, Mr. Spade. I have sat across from men who could model a risk curve in their sleep, men who could talk a room into a deal before the coffee was cold. What I haven't found very often," he paused, chose the next word with deliberate care, "is someone who calculates correctly when there's nothing in it for them." Connor was listening in the same way he'd listened to Winnie on the platform, actually following, tracking the structure beneath the words. "You were 12 minutes late," Gus said. "You were late because you chose to help a frightened woman on a subway platform rather than walk past her. You sat in the back of my conference room for 20 minutes without defending yourself, and then, when the moment required it, you walked to the front of the room and did what needed doing." He leaned back. "That's not one thing, that's a pattern." He picked up a pen from the desk, turned it once in his fingers, set it down. "I'm not offering you a consolation prize, and I'm not running a charity. What I'm offering you is the lead seat on the Alderton closing team, not as a deputy, not as the man who did the work and watches someone else present it. The actual seat. That means you're in the room when the deal signs, and you're accountable when it doesn't." Connor looked at him. "What about Douglas?" "Douglas will be informed. And Vincent." "Vincent is talented," Gus said without unkindness. "He'll land well. This isn't the right seat for him." Connor was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Gus waited. The question Patricia Shen asked, about the liability clause. Was that spontaneous, or did you prompt her to ask it? A pause. Then Gus Marchetti did something Connor hadn't seen him do in 4 months of meetings. He smiled. Not broadly, a contained, particular smile, the kind that acknowledges a perceptive question without confirming or denying it. 2 o'clock meeting concluded, Gus said. "I'll have my assistant send the paperwork to your office." Connor Spade walked out of the Marchetti Capitol building at 3:15 in the afternoon. The wind had quieted slightly. Still cold, still off the lake, but less combative, as if it had made its point and was willing to let the afternoon proceed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with no particular urgency about where he was going next. He thought about calling Douglas. He would need to, eventually. That conversation was going to be what it was going to be. He thought about his wife. They had agreed to try dinner again on Saturday. Not a reconciliation dinner, not a confrontation dinner, just dinner, which felt like the most honest version of where they were. He thought he might actually make it this time. He took out his phone, not to check notifications. There were still 26 unread, and he was going to let them sit a little longer. He opened his contacts, scrolled to a number he'd requested from Marchetti's assistant before leaving the building, and typed a short text. "Miss Pace, this is Connor Spade from the Monroe Street station this morning. I wanted to make sure you got to your daughter safely. I hope the surprise visit went well." He put his phone in his pocket. He started walking toward the red line. At the corner of Michigan and Monroe, a man in his mid-20s stood at the light with the specific posture of someone running very late and trying not to show it. Weight forward on his toes, eyes locked on the signal, jaw tight. A food delivery bag was knocked off a bicycle rack beside him, and its contents, several wrapped paper containers, scattered across the sidewalk. The bike's owner had already turned the corner. The stream of pedestrians stepped around the mess without breaking stride. Connor watched the young man's jaw work, watched him look at his watch, watched the same calculation play out across his face, the precise, familiar arithmetic of a moment that did not offer a graceful exit. The young man bent down. He gathered the containers. He stacked them carefully back into the bag, rehung it on the rack, straightened up. His face was flushed. He was definitely going to be late now. Connor walked past him, then he stopped. "Hey," Connor said. The young man turned, startled. "Whatever you're late for," Connor said, "you're going to be fine." The young man stared at him for a second. Then something in his face, tight with stress, already halfway to catastrophizing, loosened by about a degree. The light changed. Connor stepped off the curb. He didn't run. He walked at the pace of a man who had learned, in one very long and instructive morning, the precise difference between moving fast and arriving ready. The city poured around him in its usual relentless volume. Horns, wind, the distant percussion of construction onwabash. And Connor Spade walked through it with the particular steadiness of someone who has just done the right thing twice, and is only now beginning to understand that those two things were always the same thing.